Hello and welcome to the Bankers Masterclass series. I am Silvia Pavoni, economics editor of The Banker, and I'm in Port of Spain in Trinidad and Tobago to talk about the country's financial sector, its role within the economy, and plans to grow as an international financial center. I'm now joined by the governor of the Central Bank of Trinidad and Tobago, Jwala Rambarran. Thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you very much, Silvia.
So the central bank obviously plays a role of supervision in the country. The banking sector in particular is renowned as very strong. In terms of assets and Tier 1 capital, it represents about half of the Caribbean, of the whole of the Caribbean region. Yet, of course, the country is not immune from troubles and challenges.
As you've rightly indicated, we are not immune from the difficulties that many countries have been facing over the last 5 years. But we've certainly been very resilient in the face of those challenges. And one of our major challenges was actually a crisis that took place with one of our largest insurance companies that that was of a systemic nature. And following from which is Clico. Mm-hmm. Following from some of the lessons that we've learned, we realized that there were a number of financial institutions that were not under the purview of either the central bank or even the SEC as regulators, but were very systemic in nature. They were large enough, or if they were not large, the particular function that those institutions were carrying out could not be replicated by any other institution.
So what is the central bank doing?
Right. So what the bank has done is to actually identify 5 institutions that we deem SIFIs, that are outside of the banking system. Those 5 institutions are really the Unit Trust Corporation, which is the largest mutual fund provider, the National Insurance Board, which is actually the public social security provider, the Trinidad and Tobago Mortgage Finance Company, which is a very specialized mortgage entity that provides financing for low and middle income housing, the Home Mortgage Bank, which is actually the secondary market player for mortgages in the country, and the final one is the Agricultural Development Bank, which is small in size, but is the only entity that would be providing agricultural financing, particularly on behalf of the government and its various initiatives. Having identified those 5 institutions, we were able to go to the Minister of Finance and get Cabinet to agree that these 5 institutions would be deemed SIFIs and would come under the regulatory ambit of the central bank. We're now in the process of developing what I call a 2-track approach to regulation and supervision. First, we go into the SIFIs to understand really what's the nature of the beast, to get a pretty good sense of what is the governance type arrangement, what are the level of risks that we're facing. And while we're doing that, we will be working through on the legislative side to bring each of those institutions under the regulatory control of the central bank.
So and you've just started carrying out
that work has started earlier this year. We've already gone into 2 SIFIs. We're about to approach the 3rd one.
Yes.
All right. And essentially the legislative work will start sometime later this year.
So this should reinforce even further the financial sector.
Of course.
Now, obviously, when foreign investors or even people outside of the region look at financial centers in the Caribbean, you tend to think, or just countries in the Caribbean, you tend to think about the lovely beaches and the offshore space. Yeah. And of course, money laundering is always a big concern, isn't it, when looking at this part of the world, despite all the efforts that many of the financial centers have been making to get rid of this sort of...
Sure. And there are 2 points there to be made. Our model for an international financial center is totally different to that followed by the Caribbean, where they're purely offshore centers, really not integrated with the rest of the domestic economy. That is not the model that we're following. The second is that Trinidad and Tobago as a jurisdiction has always been very clean when it comes to money laundering and dealing with the counterterrorism financing activities. And what is happening in 2015 is that we will be one of the first countries to undergo a mutual evaluation process based on the new and revised Financial Action Task Force guidelines. So the central bank, the SEC, the Ministry of Finance, and the entire financial sector, they're working very feverishly to meet that examination or that assessment that will take place in the first half of January 2015. So it's a very short and compressed time period to get the country ready for what many observers say it would typically take a country at least 2 years to complete.
You're really working fast.
We're really working fast and hard on that. And while we're doing that, we also have FATCA that's happening at the same time. So it's almost like the financial sector itself is very much alive and vibrant to meeting and coming up to and exceeding international standards.
It's dealing with lots of regulation that coming both from within the country and outside of the country.
Both within and outside.
There are also the efforts in developing the capital markets.
Yes.
Yeah. So can you give me some?
Sure. We've been working very closely with the TTIFC on developing the capital markets, and we've more or less sort of bifurcated the roles, where the central bank would focus on developments within the domestic capital market, and the TTIFC, given its mandate, will focus on developments in terms of attracting, from an international perspective, those players that could help sustain and grow our capital markets. For the central bank's part, we've developed 5 working groups that comprise the major players in the financial sector, and they are actually the ones working on a particular issue, such as what should be the new instruments required, what should be the sort of capacity required in the system, and what should be the legislative changes to take us to the next, what I would call leapfrogging, to the next stage of maturity for our financial sector.
Which issue do you think is at the top of the agenda, should be at the top of the agenda?
Always at the top is regulation. You'll always hear the private sector say the regulations are never growth enhancing, or they never allow for the kind of competitive behavior that you would need. You will always hear that from the private sector. So what we're saying is, tell us what are the areas, what are the friction points, and we will see to what extent we could mitigate those or we could eliminate those. But at the same time, we always have to bear in mind, regulation will always play catch up to what happens in the domestic economy.
On top of it. Now, last time we spoke, you mentioned the survey that was undertaken to assess the country's level of financial literacy. That was 5 years ago, and the results were a bit disappointing when they saw that the government, I think, really tried to put a lot of effort in trying to raise these levels. There was another survey in 2013. The results have been analyzed now.
The results don't surprise us. They more or less corroborate what we thought would have happened in the last 5 years, which is that the level of financial literacy really needs strengthening. And my focus is on how do we do that as we move forward. And financial inclusion has become a key pillar of one of the strategic objectives for the central bank. Last year, we joined the Alliance for Financial Inclusion, which is a global network of central banks that promote financial inclusion practices around the world. We became the 100th member. And out of that, we were the first country in the Caribbean to make what is called a Maya Declaration, which basically says we commit to developing a national financial inclusion strategy that would meet the diverse needs of the various players within the country. And one of the key points out of that strategy is to take our national financial literacy program, and we are transforming it into a fully accredited financial inclusion training institute. And it's going to take a new name, a new shape, a new form, new initiatives. That program is actually going to be launched in early September this year, when we host the Global Policy Forum, which is the flagship event of the Alliance for Financial Inclusion.
So there will be...
So there's a lot that is happening, both transformative and both very purposeful in terms of impacting the citizens of this country so that they're empowered to make better financial decisions.
Thank you very much for your comments.
All right. You're welcome.